Squidward, Squidward, Squidward. No doubt, the character with the most miserable life in Bikini Bottom. He works at a job he hates, has to deal with SpongeBob 24 hours a day, and as if that weren't enough, the universe seems to be constantly against him. So today, in the worst things that ever happened to Squidward, we'll start with the time he almost lost everything in a matter of seconds. The story begins at a Krusty Krab where Mr. Krabs, in his eternal obsession with money, decides that no one can go home until he finishes counting every last cent of the day's earnings. And just when everything seems in order, the worst possible scenario occurs. The first cent he ever earned has disappeared. The horror, the tragedy, the financial apocalypse. Obviously, instead of looking for it like a normal person, Mr. Krabs panics and accuses Squidward of stealing it. And who else could it be? After all, Squidward is the only one who touches the cash register. But hey, who needs logic when you can just point your finger and yell, "Thief"? This, unsurprisingly, doesn't sit well with Squidward, who finally decides he's had enough.
Mistake? Ha! The only mistake I ever made was wasting my life at the Krusty Krab.
And there it is, the phrase that resonates with every soul who has worked a job they hate. Because let's face it, who hasn't felt at some point like they've wasted your life in a job they hate? This moment is not only iconic, but also incredibly relatable. Squidward, fed up and furious, makes a decision that many of us have dreamed of, but few of us have had the courage to make. Quit in a fit of rage. And so Squidward lives his life at a Krusty Krab behind with big aspirations. He's convinced that the world is his oyster and he can become anything he wants. Who needs a job when you've got such a buoyant optimism, right? Yeah, well, a few moments later, harsh reality crashes down on him like a giant anchor. SpongeBob meets him sometime later, but Squidward is no longer the same. Jobless, homeless, undignified. Now he lives in a cardboard box, depending on the charity of the passers-by. But the worst comes when even the cardboard box is seized. Yeah, when they don't even let you be a bomb in peace. You know you've hit rock bottom. To make matters worse, Bob asks him about his paintings, to which Squidward responds with another of the episode's most tragic lines: he had to eat them. And in that moment, we know that this man has truly lost everything. When your dreams become your last meal, you know that life hates you in a very personal way. Feeling guilty, SpongeBob does the unthinkable. He invites Squidward to live with him until he gets a new job. And at first, it all seems like a nice gesture until Squidward starts enjoying it a little too much. Go from being a friend in need to a professional parasite in record time. Oh, SpongeBob. Poor thing. This is where the episode goes from tragic to frustrating, because at this point, the audience knows that Squidward is indeed taking advantage of them. In fact, many viewers probably yelled at the screen something like, "Bob, notice!" Squidward simply has no intention of moving, and here comes the heartbreaking point. Bob loses patience and decides to take matters into his own hands. In one of the most episodes with over-the-top and satisfying scenes, SpongeBob pushes Squidward's bed, complete with Squidward on it, right into the Krusty Krab. With no other option, SpongeBob confronts Mr. Krabs and demands that he will hire Squidward, but Mr. Krabs, in his endless greed, refuses. Not even when SpongeBob repeatedly offers him dimes. Finally, SpongeBob explodes in fury. The most optimistic Sponge is furious. Here we see something rare in Bob, an uncontrollable rage that we don't often see in him. He grabs Mr. Krabs and shakes him with a rage built up by months of abuse, and just when it seems like he's gonna strangle his boss, boom, the first dime falls out of his pocket. It turns out that it was never lost. It had just been there all along, in Mr. Krabs' pants. And that's when we all realized that Squidward's life was ruined for absolutely nothing. The episode ends with Squidward rehired, but as expected, Mr. Krabs is still Mr. Krabs and accuses him of putting the coin in his pocket, which starts a new argument. Meanwhile, SpongeBob resigned, puts on his maid outfit, anticipating that his role as a servant is not over. And if "Can You Spare a Dime" has taught us anything, is that Squidward's life is an endless cycle of suffering, like when the entire universe decided to unite to torture Squidward in the most surreal way possible. It all starts out like any other day in Squidward's sad existence. He walks up to the Krusty Krab with an unusually optimistic smile, This can only mean one thing: something horrible is about to happen to him. And sure enough, the first thing he gets is SpongeBob's morning breath in the face, the literal definition of a low blow. Then the door is slammed in his face, but none of this bothers him too much. Today is a special day because his clarinet is safe in its case. No matter what happens, as long as his beloved instrument is safe, everything will be fine. But of course, the universe doesn't let him enjoy even 2 minutes of peace. A mother walks in with a baby and immediately disaster strikes. The infant draws directly on Squidward's clarinet, and at this point, we all know this wasn't gonna end well.
This is an outrage! I will no longer tolerate my personal items being soiled by the rabble that crawls into this restaurant!
There it is, the first spark of the fire. Squidward can't take it anymore, and honestly, who could blame him? He has every right to want his beloved clarinet not to be a magnet for other people's drool, so he decides to confront Mr. Krabs with something that no boss can stand: the restaurant's rule book. And of course, Mr. Krabs reacts as if Squidward had shown him a tax bill. To avoid trouble, he gives him a locker, but of course not a decent locker, but a rusty, flea-infested closet. And to top it off, he has to share it with SpongeBob. Oh, what a surprise! Bob, being Bob, cleans it thoroughly until it shines and puts away his toothbrush, while Squidward carefully puts away his clarinet. Finally, his instrument is safe, or so he thinks. But every time he gets distracted, he sees SpongeBob still messing with the locker. First, he puts velvet on it. Then he comes in with a toolbox, and here Squidward is already in "I don't like this one bit" mode. In desperation, he decides to investigate and enters the locker. What he finds defies all logic, because of course, just when we thought the episode couldn't get any weirder, we suddenly find ourselves in the nightmare alternate dimension. When Squidward later returns to check on his clarinet, he finds it missing. Obviously, SpongeBob has relocated it and offers to go find it. But the problem is that the locker has now become an endless maze with tiny doors and museum decor, because that makes total sense. In desperation, Squidward crawls through one of the doors and into a mysterious setting. The curtains open and, surprise, in the center, his clarinet. But before he can grab it, a terrifying figure appears.
This is a sacred place where clarinets can live without persecution.
At this point, we're all as confused as Squidward. When did we go from a comedy about a burger joint to an existential therapy session about the meaning of ownership? Terrified, Squidward says he has learned respect and tries to escape, but the Guardian doesn't believe him and swallows him whole, because of course, that's what happens when you don't respect clarinets. Squidward then finds himself chasing SpongeBob through a giant pinball machine. Just when he thinks it's all over, Patrick appears, but the size of a skyscraper. Meanwhile, Squidward gets sucked into a giant vacuum cleaner and explodes. But before we can wonder if that was attempted murder, he goes back to the locker. Turns out it was all a dream, or rather a nightmare that would make David Lynch cry. SpongeBob, completely unharmed, reveals that he had the clarinet the whole time because he saw that Squidward was upset. And this is where Squidward does what we would all do: he locks SpongeBob in the locker as revenge. But his revenge is short-lived. When he arrives at his long-awaited concert, he opens his case and finds SpongeBob inside. And then he completely breaks down. He runs off the stage before the nightmare continues. Anyway, another absolutely miserable workday for Squidward. If there's a lesson here, is that if you think your day can't get any worse, just wait, because you haven't yet seen the time when SpongeBob, true to his chaotic nature, does everything he can to ruin your life. The story begins with Squidward at home, excited to watch his favorite show, Casa Elegante, because if there's one thing that brings him happiness in this grey and depressing world, that is his life. Is the idea of one day living like the elite. But just when he's about to relax, his arch nemesis in the world of good taste, Squidward Elegant, calls him to brag that he's the guest of the episode, as if Squidward didn't have enough to do with in his miserable life. Now he has to watch live how this guy shows off his colossal wealth on television. It's like his only goal in life is to make other people feel bad. And it works, because Squidward can't take it anymore and decides it's his turn to shine.
Hello, my name is Squidward Tentacles, and my house is far fancier than that slob Squilliam.
There you have it, a man driven by resentment, spite, and bad decisions. If SpongeBob has taught us anything, it's that Squidward rarely gets lucky, and every time he opens his mouth to brag, he's signing his own death warrant. And here is no exception. Nicholas Withers, the host, gives him 2 hours to prepare. Squidward panics. because, surprise, his house is not fancy, it's barely functional. But in an act of utter desperation, he decides to trust the least qualified person to help him, SpongeBob. Of course, our fluffy friend isn't in the best of shape. It turns out that Patrick used to borrow his brain for the weekend in exchange for 2 chocolate bars. And the worst thing is that SpongeBob still thinks it's a good idea to help. From here on, catastrophe is imminent. First, SpongeBob paints the entire house a blue mess that would make an interior designer vomit. Then, in an attempt at redecorating, he accidentally injures Squidward's foot, and at that point, it should have been enough. He should have kicked SpongeBob out of his house and given up on his dream of impressing the world. But no, he moves on. The climax arrives. SpongeBob has to clean up the mess with a vacuum cleaner, and if you thought all of the above was bad, wait until you see what comes up next. SpongeBob, in his infinite clumsiness, decides that the house is too dirty and turns up the power to the maximum, causing the vacuum cleaner to go crazy and start devouring everything in its path. Meanwhile, Squidward is in the bathroom trying to heal his injured foot, not imagining that his house is seconds away from being reduced to rubble. When he finally comes, he runs to the door desperate to stop the domestic carnage, only to discover that the one knocking was not Nicholas, but Patrick, who needed to use his bathroom, and as if the universe was conspiring to destroy what little he has left, his toilet crawls out of the bathroom and dies in his arms, a victim of Patrick's visit. As if that wasn't enough, Patrick returns, this time to give SpongeBob his brain back, and as if this whole mess couldn't get any more absurd, the brain is sucked into the vacuum and falls right into SpongeBob's hands. The vacuum cleaner then reaches its maximum capacity and explodes. Squidward's house is reduced to rubble, but in the most ironic twist of all, Nicholas Withers and Calamarino arrive just in time to witness the final result. And this is where the unexpected happens.
Well, I'm not quite sure how to say this.
Go ahead, say it.
Squidward Tentacles, you seem to have ushered in an entire new era in house fanciness.
It's official, Squidward's life is a cruel comedy. His trashed house is seen as a masterpiece of abstract art. And not only that, but he's now the Prince of House Chic of the Year. All because of a misunderstanding, all because of an accident. Meanwhile, Squidward the smug billionaire is devastated by his defeat. Cosmic justice? Perhaps. But for Squidward, what should have been his worst day turns out to be his best. And the most ironic thing is that it was all thanks to SpongeBob, the very creature that destroyed his home in the first place. Because if there is anything worse than losing your house in an absurd accident, it is knowing that at the end of the day, you are still trapped in the same routine with the same insufferable neighbors. So we delve into Ink Lemonade. The story begins with Patrick shouting "Lemonade" to attract customers to his stand. And from the get-go, we can tell that this isn't a particularly successful business. Squidward, his patience wearing thin and his nose soon to be a victim of traumatic events, goes outside to see what's going on and discovers that Patrick isn't even selling real lemonades. He only has pitchers of water. Like any sane person, instead of just ignoring him and going about his day, Squidward decides to help him by giving him rotten lemons. And because this episode clearly has no interest in sanity, Patrick decides that the solution to improve the taste is to add a band-aid from his armpit. Gross doesn't begin to describe it. Squidward, hoping that the universe will allow him a moment of peace, returns home to shave his nose, but Patrick, in his incessant need to feel at everything, now decides to yell into a megaphone, sending Squidward's razor into a destructive frenzy. Imagine wanting to take a second to take care of yourself and ending up electrocuted because your neighbor doesn't understand what low volume means. Outside, a brave customer tries Patrick's lemonade, only to discover the band-aid in his mouth and feel the urge to vomit. And here, Patrick does something that would define the tone of the episode. He gives him the grandiose idea to vomit in Squidward's house. As expected, Squidward storms out only to sleep on the puddle of vomit and land in yet another wave of humiliation. Because if this episode teaches us anything, it's that there are no limits to Squidward's degradation. The big Patrick's idea now is to replace lemons with the contents of a toy fire truck. Enter SpongeBob, who decides to join in the madness and yell into a megaphone, scaring Squidward so much that he sprays ink out of his nose, and this is where the story takes a crazy turn. Patrick, with his brilliant business intellect, decides to use ink as an ingredient for black lemonade, and of course, SpongeBob, in his insatiable need to consume questionable things, tries it. He gets instantly sick like any being with a normal immune system, but then decides that it's actually delicious because, of course, drinking your neighbor's bodily fluids is a great idea. When a customer comes in for black lemonade, Patrick realizes that he needs more ink. But there's a problem. Squidward, for some reason, doesn't want to give her any more of his dignity. So Patrick, being the ruthless entrepreneur that he is, decides to resort to the ultimate business strategy: absolute terror. Patrick begins to scare Squidward in increasingly disturbing ways, including opening up his own body and making his internal organs talk. Because if there's one thing kids wanted to see from SpongeBob, it was Patrick doing a body horror movie rendition. As a result, Squidward spills more ink, which means more lemonade for Patrick's position.
Ooh, I think you better get some more black lemonade, buddy.
Sure, SpongeBob, because what this episode needed was for someone to actively encourage this torture. But Patrick doesn't stop there. Now he decides to bring a giant spider to Squidward's house just when he's trying to relax. And as expected, the sight of a monstrous creature causes Squidward to expel more ink than a squid in an existential crisis. With a line for lemonade growing, Patrick needs another plan. Squidward, now reduced to a state of constant paranoia, starts acting erratically. And this is where we get to the climax. Patrick turns the outside of Squidward's house into a haunted area because, of course, why not? Enter Squidward, and in a state of absolute panic, he begins spewing ink like his life depends on it. Finally, when he realizes that this was all orchestrated by SpongeBob and Patrick, he decides that if you can't beat them, join them. It seems like a clever move, but Squidward forgets that he can't just produce ink at will, so he turns to Don the Whale to scare him. The problem is that Don isn't exactly subtle and ends up scaring Squidward so much that he sprays ink all over the customers, and so his black lemonade business ends in the ultimate disaster. Everyone finds out about the secret ingredient and vomits all over his house. As for SpongeBob and Patrick, they've already moved on to the next big idea: selling cookies. Squidward tries one and learns that they're made from spider eggs. Right next to him, a spider watches him, prompting him to scream, spiders coming out of his mouth, and spray more ink. This episode is basically a manual on how to psychologically torture a character until they are reduced to a shell of their former existence. And while SpongeBob's absurd humor can be fun, Ink Lemonade takes it to an extreme that even fans consider too much. Thanks for watching, subscribe, check out our other videos, and remember, if you see a black lemonade stand, run in the opposite direction.